Hey, Udyr here. Welcome to the first episode of Glorious Evolution, a series where I'll go over some of my ideas for potential improvements to League. This episode we'll talk about Udyr. With Riot's rework being released soon, I wanted to imagine my own rework and see how it matches up. Okay, let's get into it. So, what could be improved in Udyr's current kit? Well, first of all, his passive is not very interesting. A simple bonus to movement speed and attack speed could make sense if you gain these stats under compelling conditions, but not if it just forces you to constantly press abilities to maintain full stacks. Instead of coming up with an interesting way to have bonus, movement speed and attack speed, I decided to go in a completely different direction. If you know Udyr's lore, you know he is a shaman that can listen to the thoughts of wild animals and other people, something that is not reflected in his current kit. With this in mind, I decided to draw inspiration from Fiddlesticks' passive and have a passive that permanently changes his trinket. It would be called something like Spirit Walker's Gift, and it would be like Sweeper, but with some differences. It would reveal enemies in real time, instead of at regular intervals, and it would have a longer reveal range, similar to Rek'Sai's Tremor Sense. But revealed enemies would only show as spheres of energy, like in Mordekaiser's ultimate, which would only let you distinguish between champions, monsters or minions, and wards, based on sphere size or color. And finally, the ability would not disable wards, as Udyr's gift would only give him the ability to sense them. Of course, the passive would still make reference to the way his stances work, like today. Well, time for the active abilities. Udyr has 4 basic abilities, and in my opinion, that doesn't work very well in League. Don't get me wrong, I think differences in champions' kits can be very good, but in this case, I don't see a real benefit to it. Instead, I see 2 big problems. First, it makes it awkward to distribute your skill points, and second, you don't have any exciting high power moments that an ultimate ability can provide. About the distribution of skill points, this is something that Chat already tried to improve in patch 9.13, by making it possible to put a 6th point into each skill. This is an improvement because it allows you to keep leveling the skills that you care about, but it also made the issue more obvious. Nowadays, you just leave one skill at one point, making it almost useless in the late game. You are then left with 3 basic abilities, like other champions, but you don't have a real ultimate. This brings us to the second big issue. Again, not having a real ultimate makes it so Udyr doesn't have any moments where he feels extra powerful, which is not very exciting. Riot feels the same way in this regard, but after some iterations, they decided to address this by giving him a passive that makes him more powerful in some occasions. I understand that they don't want to give him an ultimate, to avoid making him drastically different, but in my opinion, an ultimate is just what he needs. Notice that this also leaves the passive slot free for some other passive that can be used to address some other issue, like the one I showed you, that makes his kit more in line with his lore. Additionally, I think that in Udyr's case, 3 basic abilities is just enough. One stands for attack, one for defense, and another for utility. As you know, currently there are 2 stances that have damage as their main output, which I see as unnecessary. Sure, there are differences in the stances, and this can reflect in some differences in gameplay, but I don't think this is enough to compensate for the downsides it brings. To me, Udyr is about deciding which stance is best moment to moment, not about deciding which stance is better at the beginning of the game. So, if Udyr is going to have 3 basic abilities and an ultimate, what would these look like? Well, Riot already revealed to us that in the upcoming rework, Udyr will be able to conjure some of the power of the Freljordian demigods. This was also already hinted at in Silence for the Damned, where Udyr and other shamans are greatly influenced and even consumed by the power of a demigod, Volibear. In the lore, it seems like Udyr would not resort to the power of Volibear in particular, because he is kind of evil. But I like the idea that in a really desperate time, Udyr might be able to do it. To me, this matches perfectly the idea of an ultimate ability, which gives you a lot of power, but has a great cost to use, which usually translates into a really long cooldown. When I started reimagining Udyr's kit, I also felt like this power of the demigods flavor was a cool way to go with, because the stances on his current kit include both the bear and the phoenix stance. These represent 2 out of the 3 Freljord demigods that are currently in League's roster, Anivia and Volibear. If we add the other one, Ornn, or the Ram, that leaves us with 3, the number of basic abilities I am aiming for. These, however, are not the only demigods in Freljord, and in Riot's case it seems like they will add a 4th god to the kit, presumed to be the Iron Boar. In my case though, I decided to stick with the other 3. I know more about them, and they have their own kits in League to draw inspiration from. Just as a note, even if in terms of lore Udyr can tap into the power of more than 3 animals, I think it is not needed to have them all included in the kit. We only need some that represent the ability to use different stances and change between them. Additionally, the more stances there are, the higher the risk that some redundancies exist, like in the case of the current Tiger and Phoenix stance. So, let's look at what the new abilities would look like. The stances would be Bear to represent Volibear, Ram to represent Ornn, and the Eagle to represent Anivia. The Eagle stance would be for improved damage to replace the old Tiger and Phoenix stances. The Bear stance would be for improved durability, that would be like old Turtle stance. The Ram stance would be about utility and would be similar to the old Bear stance. I feel like attack damage should be the way to improve his damage output. So, in this case, the Eagle stance would scale only off attack damage, and the possibility to go for ability power would no longer exist. I think this is mostly beneficial, as it would make his kit cleaner and would still leave him with decent flexibility in builds. You could still go for full damage, full tank, or something in between, with bruiser itemization. To round it all out, his ultimate would be the portion of the kit that represents Udyr's ability to draw from the power of the gods. But we'll get into that in a bit. First, let's take a look at the way his base stances would work. For me, the current 3-hit passive feels unsatisfying. It feels bad to have 2 out of 3 attacks do nothing special when you are a champion that revolves around basic attacking. Also, it can be hard to keep track of. My main goal is to make each of his attacks feel special, but keep the decision between switching or not switching stances interesting. For this, I ended up with the idea that each stance works on a 2-hit pattern, where both attacks do something different, alternating back and forth, kind of like Set's passive, but with the same attack speed between attacks, just different on-hit bonuses on each one. Here is what they could look like. For the Eagle stance, the odd attacks would have a simple bonus to damage on hit, and the even attacks would apply a damage over time effect. For the Bear stance, the odd attacks would heal Udyr, and the even ones would apply a debuff that reduced the target's damage output for a short duration. For the Ram stance, the odd attacks would have a small bonus to Udyr's attack range and would make him dash to the target. Relax, I'm not talking about some crazy long distance dashes, just something that you can feel a bit more than his current lunge on his E, which is barely noticeable. Remember that in his current version, Udyr can, more often than not, reach his enemies with his insane movement speed. The added mobility of these short dashes could be balanced out by simply reducing some of his access to movement speed. And finally, the even attacks in Ram stance would stun the enemy, with a cooldown per target, just like it is today. In this iteration, the odd hits always have some added value, and the even hits are only useful sometimes, since they have an effect with a duration or a cooldown per target. However, the even hits can be more powerful if their benefits are applicable. Since the effects change with each attack you make, the decision of when to use a stance would be one you would make after each attack. Nowadays, this is not the case. Since 2 out of 3 attacks don't have any bonuses, you use the bonuses on the first attack and then change stance as soon as you can, or you patiently wait for the 4th attack to get the bonus again. Of course, each ability would have an active, like today. Activating Eagle Stance would cause Udyr to do a spinning maneuver, damaging all nearby enemies. Activating Bear Stance would cause Udyr to unleash a mighty roar that would shield himself. Additionally, if there were enemy champions in close proximity, the shield amount would increase. And lastly, activating Ram Stance would apply a brief but heavy slow to enemies in a large area around Udyr. All of these effects would have an immediate or short output, which I think is better than the current actives that give bonuses that last almost as long as the ability's cooldown. If the bonuses are up almost all the time, they feel more like a passive than an active effect to me. This saturation also removes the weird mixes between stances, where you could be a fast running or fast attacking turtle, for example. You might have noticed that these all have some kind of area of effect. If that's weird to you, maybe it will all look better once we have a look over the ultimate. As this ability represents Udyr drawing from the power of the gods, I went with the name Freljord's Wild Wrath. Once activated, the ability would improve Udyr's basic abilities with some additional mechanics for a short period of time. This upgrade to abilities would be something pretty new to League. Even though champions like Heimerdinger or LeBlanc can use an upgraded version of a basic ability with their ultimate, no champion improves all basic abilities at once, being able to use multiple for a short time. But this mechanic makes the most sense in a champion like Udyr, who has a big part of his kit's power in passive effects that can only be used one at a time. First up, let's look at the Eagle Stance, representing Anivia or the ice. Notice that I want to have this stance be purely about damage. It may not be very obvious at first, but, in League, Anivia doesn't only use ice to CC her enemies. She uses it to make them take extra damage when she then hits them with her E. So, I decided to expand on this idea of making enemies more vulnerable to damage. With this in mind, I imagined that, on activation, the empowered Q would make the area it covered in ice for a few seconds. Enemies in the ice would be affected by frostbite, making them take more damage. The damage over time from the passive's even attacks would also make the targets frostbite for the duration. Next, for the upgraded Bear Stance, representing Volibear or the Lightning, on activation, the area used to check for nearby enemies would be briefly electrified, with the similar effects to old Volibear's Majestic Roar. Champion's hit would be disarmed for a short duration. Disarm is a very specific status effect that, in case you don't know, makes enemies unable to attack. Aurelia's ultimate used to do it. I selected this status effect because it is a form of CC that mostly impacts the enemy's ability to do damage, and I want this stance to be about durability and not generic utility. For the passive component, the even attacks would cause a chain lightning to bounce between some targets, like Volibear's passive, and this would apply the debuff to damage to all enemies hit. Lastly, for the Ram Stance, representing Ornn or the Fire, on activation, enemies affected by the slow would also have Brittle applied to them, which, up to now, is an Ornn specific mechanic. Just for clarification, Udyr would not have Ornn's special interaction with Brittle of knocking back the target with a basic attack, but he could still consume the debuff for extra damage and an extended stun. Passively, Udyr would be unstoppable while dashing, to represent how Ornn is unstoppable during his W. I think this would be very interesting since, how well you time your attacks can have a big impact if you manage to completely negate some CC. To round it all out, Udyr would gain bonus movement speed and attack speed for the duration of the ability, to help him make better use of the ability's upgrades. Well, that's it. That's my take on the Udyr rework. Thanks for sticking till the end. I appreciate all feedback, so if you have any, please drop it in the comments, and also I plan on doing more videos like this, so if you feel like that is something you would be interested in, you can subscribe and click the bell thing to get notified. Later.